What if I told you that the man who taught over 10 million people how to survive their darkest moments nearly died in silence? Not from a war, not from an assassination attempt, not from any dramatic headline-worthy cause, but from cleaning out a dead man's house. What if I told you that the same voice that echoed across sold-out arenas on 4 continents, the voice that told an entire generation to stand up straight and face the chaos of life without flinching, was reduced to complete silence for nearly a month? Unable to speak, unable to move, unable to call his own daughter. What if I told you that the man who built a global empire on the idea that suffering is the price of meaning found himself paying a price so steep that no philosophy on earth could cover it? This is not a story about a lecture. This is not a story about pronouns or politics or the culture wars that made him famous. This is the story behind the story. The one that unfolded in hospital rooms and foreign countries and mold-contaminated houses while the world was busy debating whether Jordan Peterson was a hero or a villain. Because here is the truth that neither side of that debate wants to sit with. He almost died. Twice. And the second time, the thing that nearly killed him was something so ordinary, so invisible, so completely disconnected from everything his critics ever attacked him for and everything his supporters ever celebrated him for, that it forces every single one of us to ask a question we would much rather not ask. What happens when the rules are not enough? Stay with us. Because by the time this story is over, you will understand Jordan Peterson in a way that no interview, no debate, no best-selling book has ever allowed you to before. And you will understand something about your own life that you may not have been ready to hear until right now. Jordan Peterson was not supposed to become one of the most recognized intellectual voices of the 21st century. He was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, and raised in Fairview, a small weathered town buried in the far northwest corner of Canada, where winters stretch long enough to teach even the youngest children that endurance is not optional. It is simply the price of living there. His father Walter taught school. His mother Beverly worked as a librarian at the local campus of Grande Prairie Regional College. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. They were not the kind of family that produces Harvard professors and global best-selling authors by any recognizable formula. But they were present. They valued books. And in a town where ambition could freeze solid before it ever found direction, that turned out to be enough of a foundation to build something extraordinary on. It was a school librarian named Sandy Notley whose daughter Rachel would later become Premier of Alberta, who first handed the teenage Peterson the kind of books that most adults spend their entire lives avoiding. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, Ayn Rand. These were not comfort reads. These were writers who had stared directly into the machinery of totalitarianism and mass murder and ideological collapse, and had written about what they saw without softening a single syllable. Jordan Peterson, barely a teenager in a frozen prairie town with no particular reason to care about Soviet gulags or dystopian futures, read every single one of them. And something in those pages unsettled him in a way that would never fully resolve for the rest of his life. He joined the New Democratic Party in his teens, the political left, believing as many idealistic young people do that the right system could repair the broken world. But the more he read about ideology, about how brilliant, well-meaning people had built systems in the 20th century that ended in catastrophe, the more he felt that the question was not which political party was correct. The question was deeper and darker than that. Why do human beings keep choosing chaos and cruelty, even when they sincerely believe they are building paradise? He quit the party at 18, not out of cynicism, out of hunger for an answer that politics simply could not provide. He enrolled at Grande Prairie Regional College, and then transferred to the University of Alberta, where he earned a degree in political science in 1982. But political science only described the surface of the problem. The real questions lived somewhere else. They lived in the architecture of the human mind. He went back to the University of Alberta and earned a second bachelor's degree, this time in psychology, in 1984. Then came McGill University in Montreal, where he pursued his doctorate under Robert O. Pill, one of the world's leading researchers in addiction and aggression. His doctoral thesis examined the psychological markers that predisposed people to alcoholism. He was not collecting credentials for their own sake. He was building piece by piece a framework for understanding the darkest corners of human behavior. By 1991, he had his doctorate in clinical psychology. And then Harvard called. From 1993 to 1998, Jordan Peterson lived in Arlington, Massachusetts, teaching and conducting research at one of the most prestigious universities on earth. His work focused on personality, aggression, substance abuse, and the psychology of belief. He was not a celebrity. He was not a controversy. He was a serious, driven, somewhat intense academic whose students described him as someone who made them feel that ideas had actual consequences, that the way you understood the world determined how you would live in it. One of his former Harvard students, novelist Greg Hurwitz, later said Peterson was the single most influential teacher he had ever encountered in his life. In 1998, Peterson returned to Canada and joined the faculty of the University of Toronto. He saw approximately 20 patients per week in private clinical practice. He developed lectures on mythology, psychology, and the meaning structures that hold human civilization together. He was not yet famous. He was not yet a lightning rod. He was simply a professor who took ideas seriously enough to make some people uncomfortable and others feel, perhaps for the first time, genuinely understood. In 1999, he published his first book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, a dense, sprawling work that attempted nothing less than a unified theory of how human beings construct meaning from chaos. It took him 13 years to write. It sold at first barely enough copies to fill a modest living room. It did not matter. The ideas were already spreading through his lectures, his classroom, his clinical practice. And Jordan Peterson, the quiet boy from Fairview who had once read Solzhenitsyn in a school library while snow buried the prairie outside, was becoming something he had never planned to become. He was becoming a man the world would find impossible to ignore. But the world does not give that kind of attention for free. The price Peterson would eventually pay for it was something no book, not even the 13-year one he had poured himself into, had ever prepared him to understand. For 20 years, Jordan Peterson had done exactly what serious academics are supposed to do. He published research. He taught classes. He treated patients. He built ideas slowly and carefully the way a cathedral is built, stone by stone, with no expectation of applause. And then in September 2016, he uploaded a YouTube video. 3 videos actually. Simple in format. No studio lighting, no production team. Just a professor at his desk speaking directly into a camera about something a growing number of people had been thinking, but had not heard anyone in a position of authority say out loud. The videos were titled Professor Against Political Correctness. In them, Peterson announced he would refuse to use government-mandated gender-neutral pronouns with students or faculty at the University of Toronto. The Canadian Parliament was preparing to pass Bill C-16, legislation that would add gender identity and expression as protected categories under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Peterson argued that compelling a citizen to use specific language under threat of legal consequence crossed a line that free societies should never cross. He called it compelled speech. He called it the first step toward the kind of ideological enforcement he had spent decades studying in the historical wreckage of the 20th century. The university threatened him. Student activists confronted him on campus. Faculty unions condemned him publicly. Journalists lined up to declare him dangerous. And the internet exploded. Within a month, his videos had accumulated more than 400,000 views. Within a year, his Patreon funding had grown from $1,000 a month to more than $50,000. Letters arrived from across the world, from young men especially, but also from women, from people of every background, saying some version of the same thing. I thought I was the only one who felt this way. Peterson did not back down. Not from the university, not from the press, not from the organized protests that greeted him on campus. He stood at the center of the storm with a calmness that his supporters found heroic and his critics found infuriating in equal measure. He had studied authoritarian systems for 40 years. He believed with a conviction that was almost physical in its intensity that the pattern he was watching unfold had a historical precedent. And that precedent ended badly. The more the opposition pressed, the more visible he became. By 2018, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos was published. It was not an academic book. It was not a political manifesto. It was something rarer and harder to categorize. A serious work of ideas written in language that ordinary people could actually read. Grounded in psychology, mythology, evolutionary biology, and the kind of hard-won clinical wisdom that only comes from sitting across from real human suffering for 20 years. It sold 10 million copies. He appeared on stages around the world. His conversations on podcasts ran for 3 and 4 hours and accumulated millions of views. He became, as numerous publications described him, one of the most influential public intellectuals in the Western world. But influence at that scale is not clean. It does not arrive without a shadow. The attacks intensified in proportion to the reach. He was called a fascist by some and a prophet by others, and neither label had much relationship to the actual man sitting behind the desk. His words were clipped, recontextualized, and weaponized by people on every side of every argument. Journalists who had never read his books wrote lengthy pieces about the danger he represented. Online communities that had never spoken to him claimed him as their patron saint. He was performing at a pace that was by any reasonable medical standard unsustainable. World tours, hundreds of interviews, a clinical practice, a podcast, university obligations, and underneath all of it, something his audiences could not see from their seats. A body that was beginning quietly and without announcement to send signals that it could not keep up. His diet had shifted dramatically. Starting in 2016, he had restricted himself to meat and a narrow list of vegetables in an attempt to manage what he described as an autoimmune disorder and severe depression. By 2018, he had eliminated the vegetables entirely. The diet controlled some symptoms. It also isolated him metabolically and socially from the ordinary rhythms of life. And then there was the other thing. The thing the cameras never captured. The thing that makes everything else in this story make a different kind of sense. His wife Tammy had received a diagnosis that arrived like a verdict. A rare kidney cancer called Bellini duct carcinoma. Rare not in the gentle sense of uncommon, but in the clinical sense of poorly understood, difficult to treat, and statistically unforgiving. Physicians had not offered much room for optimism. Peterson was carrying his global fame in one hand and his family's survival in the other. He was standing on stages telling thousands of people how to bear their burdens, and meaning was to be found in suffering, and responsibility was the antidote to despair. And no one in the audience knew that the man delivering those words was privately living inside a suffering that no lecture, no matter how brilliant, had prepared him to manage. The man who told millions of people to carry their burden willingly was discovering that some burdens do not respond to philosophy. Some burdens require a different kind of reckoning entirely. In 2016, a physician had prescribed Peterson clonazepam, a benzodiazepine, a class of medication used for anxiety and muscle tension. The dose was low and the intention was manageable. Peterson was dealing with an intense physical reaction tied to his restrictive diet and the crushing pressure of his suddenly exploding public life. At first, the medication helped. Then in 2019, the The dose was increased, and something in his body responded in a way that no one had predicted and no one initially fully understood. Benzodiazepine dependence does not announce itself like a dramatic breaking point. It creeps. It rewires. It takes the brain's capacity to regulate fear and calm and quietly dismantles it, so that the anxiety the medication was meant to suppress returns, not at its original intensity, but amplified. A cruelty built into the pharmacology itself. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines is by clinical consensus among the most physically dangerous and psychologically tormenting processes a human nervous system can endure. Peterson tried to stop. What followed was a period he has described only in fragments. A darkness so total that the man who had spent his career analyzing suffering from a clinical distance was now submerged in it, without any distance at all. Meanwhile, Tammy's cancer had returned. The diagnosis that had once been called terminal had briefly retreated, then came back to demand attention again. Peterson was managing his own neurological collapse while watching his wife fight for her life, while the global machinery of his public career continued to demand appearances and interviews and the performance of certainty from a man who was privately coming apart. By late 2019, his family made a decision that would generate headlines around the world. They flew him to Moscow. North American physicians, Peterson's family reported, were unwilling to provide the treatment they believed he needed. A medically induced coma designed to allow his nervous system to be stabilized without the brutal conscious experience of withdrawal. It was a controversial approach, unconventional, the kind of thing that makes medical establishments deeply uncomfortable. But conventional had already failed. In Russia, doctors examined him upon arrival and found something that made an already dire situation worse. He had developed pneumonia in both lungs. His body, already under siege from within, was now fighting an infection as well. The induced coma went ahead regardless. For 8 days, Jordan Peterson was unconscious in a Moscow hospital. His brain and body held in a kind of forced stillness while clinicians attempted to give his shattered nervous system a chance to reset. He was placed in an intensive care unit for 4 weeks following the coma. During that time, he lost significant motor function. He could not walk normally. His coordination was compromised. The man who had stood on stages in front of thousands, who had debated the most combative interviewers in the world with the stillness of someone entirely at home in conflict, now struggled with the basic physical grammar of movement. His family moved him to Serbia for continued rehabilitation, and for months, long silent months during which the internet buzzed with rumors and his absence spoke louder than any lecture ever had, Jordan Peterson disappeared from public life entirely. He reappeared in June 2020, gaunt and clearly changed, in a conversation recorded on his daughter Michaela's podcast in Belgrade. He spoke carefully. He moved carefully. The sharpness was still there somewhere underneath, but it was wrapped now in something new. A fragility he had never shown before. An awareness that the body is not a vehicle you can simply push past its limits indefinitely. The man who returned from Russia and Serbia was not the same man who had left. He had traveled to the outer edge of what a human body can withstand and come back with the knowledge that the edge is real, that it does not negotiate, and that the rules for life he had given the world offered no exemption, not even for the man who wrote them. He had survived. But survival, as he was about to learn, was only the beginning of the reckoning. Because the next crisis was already forming. Not in a hospital in Moscow, but in the walls of his own home. By late 2020 and into 2021, Peterson was re-emerging. Careful, deliberate, carrying himself with the particular gravity of someone who has been somewhere most people never go and returned with information they cannot fully translate into ordinary language. The world welcomed him back loudly. But the version unfolding behind every camera, beneath every headline about his return, was quieter, more fragile, and far more defining. Tammy fought. That is the word her family uses, and it is not a cliché in this context. It is a clinical description. She underwent treatment. She endured what cancer treatment requires people to endure. And somewhere in that process, in a development that her physicians struggled to fully explain, the cancer responded. The trajectory shifted, and the prognosis that had seemed fixed began to move in a direction that no one had confidently predicted. She survived. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost. But she survived. Jordan returned to work carrying that awareness like a second skeleton. In 2021, he published Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, a sequel that was in many ways a more personal document than its predecessor. Where 12 rules had been built on the architecture of order against chaos, Beyond Order wrestled with something harder. The recognition that too much order is its own kind of prison, and that the rigid structures we build to protect ourselves can become the very things that suffocate us. He resigned from the University of Toronto. After decades in academia, Harvard, McGill, Toronto, he walked away from the institution that had given him his platform and his credibility and his identity as a professor. It was not a bitter departure. It was something more like a recognition that the next chapter could not be written inside the same walls as the previous ones. He joined a major conservative media platform as a podcaster and commentator. He launched the Peterson Academy, an online education platform offering pre-recorded lectures from world-class academics built around the idea that serious intellectual content should not be locked behind university tuition or institutional gatekeeping. His daughter Michaela became its chief executive officer. The platform grew rapidly, eventually offering more than 70 courses with a dedicated mobile application. He relocated to the United States, settling in Paradise Valley, Arizona, citing frustrations with what he described as an increasingly hostile regulatory and political environment in Canada, including a protracted legal battle with the College of Psychologists of Ontario over social media posts they deemed professionally problematic. To observers, it looked like expansion. Like a man who had survived catastrophe and emerged more productive, more determined, more free. And in some ways, it was exactly that. But expansion at that pace after a body has already been through what Peterson's body had been through carries a cost that does not always present an invoice immediately. Sometimes the bill arrives later. Sometimes it arrives all at once. In the summer of 2025, Jordan Peterson was helping clean out his father-in-law's house following a death in the family. A task so ordinary it barely warrants description. The kind of thing people do without thinking, without precaution, without any sense that the room they are moving through might be the most dangerous place they have entered in years. The room was contaminated with mold. And in that ordinary moment, in a house full of grief and dust and the accumulated belongings of a life just ended, the next chapter of Jordan Peterson's story began. It would be the most frightening one yet. The house had mold. Not visible, dramatic mold. Not the kind that signals danger with obvious color and smell. The invisible kind. The kind that colonizes the walls and ceilings and air of water-damaged buildings and releases biotoxins so fine they cannot be seen and so persistent they cannot simply be washed away. The kind that certain immune systems, particularly those already compromised by years of stress, prior illness, and medical intervention, cannot defend against. Peterson's immune system had already been through a war. Russia, Serbia, the benzodiazepine crisis, the years of extreme dietary restriction, Tammy's cancer, the relentless schedule of a man who had never fully allowed his body the recovery it had been requesting for years. It had nothing left in reserve. Within weeks of the mold exposure, something in Peterson's body broke open. The diagnosis that eventually emerged was chronic inflammatory response syndrome, known as CIRS, a condition in which the immune system, triggered by biotoxin exposure, enters a state of chronic overreaction. It stops fighting a specific threat and starts attacking the body itself, igniting inflammation across multiple organ systems simultaneously, relentlessly, without an off switch. The very system designed to protect you becomes the thing that is destroying you. The inflammation escalated with brutal speed. By late summer 2025, CIRS had progressed into pneumonia, and pneumonia in a body already overwhelmed by systemic inflammation progressed into sepsis, a condition in which infection spreads into the bloodstream, triggering a cascade of organ stress that physicians describe, without exaggeration, as a race between treatment and death. Peterson was rushed into emergency hospitalization. He was placed in an intensive care unit where he would remain for nearly a month. During those weeks that stretched into a silence his audience had never experienced from him before, Jordan Peterson was unable to communicate with his own family. The man whose voice had reached hundreds of millions of people across every platform imaginable could not speak to his daughter, could not speak to his wife, could not speak to anyone. Michaela Fuller, his daughter, delivered the updates the world was waiting for. She did not soften them. She described her father's condition as a near-death experience. She described the preceding weeks as exceedingly difficult and terrifying. And she noted that on the same day her father was rushed to the hospital, her own newborn daughter had been rushed to the hospital with a near-fatal cardiac crisis. 2 generations of the same family, simultaneously fighting for their lives in the same impossible summer. She called it a spiritual attack. Inside the intensive care unit, Peterson's neurological system began to show additional damage. Doctors identified critical illness polyneuropathy, a condition in which the nerves themselves are compromised by the combination of severe infection and prolonged inflammation. His motor function was affected. The precision of movement that most people take entirely for granted became uncertain, unreliable, a system that required conscious effort where none had ever been needed before. The man who had once stood on stages across 4 continents now faced uncertainty over whether he could lift his own limbs with the command he intended. By October 2025, he had stabilized enough to leave the intensive care unit, but he remained hospitalized for ongoing treatment until December. 5 months in total spent inside medical facilities, fighting a condition that his specialists described as requiring the kind of careful long-term management that does not resolve on any schedule the patient controls. In December 2025, his family confirmed he had returned home. Home in this context meant Paradise Valley, Arizona. The house he had moved to when he left Canada. The house that was supposed to represent a new chapter, a fresh start, a life built on his own terms. He was home. He was alive. He was not well. Michaela was careful with her words in the way that people are careful when the truth is both necessary and painful. Her father, she said, was not doing well, but he was not doing as badly as he had been. She asked for prayers. She asked for patience. And she said something that landed with a particular weight for the millions of people who had spent years listening to her father tell them how to carry their burdens without breaking. We are waiting, hoping, and praying for recovery. The man who had an answer for everything had no answer for this. Only the waiting, only the hoping, only the slow, unglamorous, profoundly human work of trying to heal. As of early 2026, Peterson is not in the intensive care unit. He is not in a hospital. He is alive, which is not a small thing, because there were weeks in the summer and fall of 2025 when alive was genuinely in question. A team of specialists continues to manage his recovery. The ongoing neurological complications, the systemic inflammation that CIRS leaves behind like a tide that recedes but never fully withdraws. The slow and unpredictable process of rebuilding a nervous system that was pushed past every reasonable limit. Progress, his daughter says, is gradual. Progress in cases like this is also nonlinear. There are better days and worse days. And the worst days carry a particular cruelty for a man whose entire intellectual identity was built on the idea that discipline and will and the courageous confrontation of suffering can move a person forward. CRS does not respond to will. Polyneuropathy does not respond to discipline. The body, when it breaks at this depth, operates on its own timeline, indifferent to the urgency of the person inside it. What remains in the absence of the lectures and the debates and the worldwide tours and the relentless engine of public intellectual life is something quieter and more essential. His family. Michaela visits every day, sometimes for hours. She has described those visits with a simplicity that says more than any elaborate tribute could. She is there. He is there. And that is enough. The Peterson Academy, the online education platform they co-founded, the project that was supposed to be one chapter of his legacy, has continued growing without him at the center of it. 70 courses. A mobile application. A daughter who runs it with the same intensity her father once brought to everything he touched. He watches the courses now. Michaela has said he watches them from home in the quiet of recovery, and he likes them. There is something almost unbearably human about that image. A man who spent his life building a cathedral of ideas, sitting in its pew for the first time, finally still enough to look up at what he made. Tammy is with him. The woman who battled terminal cancer and survived it. Who watched her husband disappear into Russia and reappear changed. Who held the family together through crises that would have fractured most. She is there. 35 years of marriage. And the thing that has outlasted every controversy, every health collapse, every cultural firestorm is the simple, unglamorous, irreplaceable fact of two people choosing each other through all of it. His son Julian is there. His grandchildren are there. The people who knew Jordan Peterson before the world did are the ones surrounding him now. And the world, the vast, opinionated, endlessly arguing world that he helped shape and that helped shape him, is watching from a respectful distance, waiting for a return that may come slowly or differently, or in a form that none of us have fully anticipated. Here is what Jordan Peterson's story reveals beneath all the medical detail and the dramatic timeline. It reveals that the cost of carrying truth at the scale he carried it through courtrooms and campuses and television studios and sold-out theaters on every continent is not abstract. It is physical. It accumulates in the nervous system, in the immune system, in the spaces between the moments the camera captured and the moments it did not. It reveals that the rules he gave the world were not wrong. They were real and they worked, and millions of people built better lives because of them. But rules are not armor, and meaning is not medicine. And even the most disciplined, most purposeful, most intellectually courageous life cannot negotiate with a body that has finally reached its limit. It reveals something about his daughter. A woman who has faced her own considerable battles with health and public life, showing up every day without announcement or performance. Presence as its own kind of philosophy. It reveals something about Tammy, who survived what was supposed to be unsurvivable, and who is now sitting beside the man she married before anyone knew his name, in the quiet of a house in Arizona, doing the most ordinary and sacred thing two people can do for each other. Staying. And perhaps most of all, it reveals something about the man himself. Jordan Peterson has spent his life arguing that suffering is not an obstacle to a meaningful life. It is the mechanism of it. That the willingness to pick up your burden, the real one, the one you did not choose and cannot put down, and carry it anyway with your eyes open, is the closest thing to nobility that ordinary human beings can achieve. He is living that argument now. Not from a stage. Not from behind a microphone. Not with an audience measuring every word for intellectual precision. He is living it in a bedroom in Arizona. On the days when getting up is hard. When the neurological damage makes simple things complicated. When the silence is louder than any crowd he ever stood before. And if you have followed this story from the small town of Fairview to the libraries of Harvard to the hospitals of Moscow and Belgrade, and now to the quiet of Paradise Valley, you already understand something that no lecture could have taught you as clearly as this life has. The map of meaning is not a guarantee. It is a compass. And even the man who drew it has to find his own way through the dark. That is the lesson Jordan Peterson could not have planned, could not have written, could not have delivered from any stage. The lesson that only arrives when everything you built with your own hands is no longer enough to protect you. When the philosophy that worked stops working. When the strength you spent a lifetime developing is simply not equal to what is being asked of it. And yet you are still here. Still breathing. Still surrounded by the people who chose you before the world ever knew your name. Still watching what you made from the quiet of a room where the only thing left to do is heal. Keep going, he once told millions of people. Especially when it is hard. Especially when the rules are not enough. Especially then. He is still following that instruction. One day at a time. In a house in Arizona. Surrounded by the people who love him. Waiting, as all of us eventually must, for the body to find its way back to the life that is still waiting to be lived.